the College of Libertarians at Fort State. We're a club dedicated to promoting the ideas of liberty and having discussions on these kind of topics. Tonight's a special night. We have Dr. Daniel. We have Dr. Daniel D'Amico here to give a lecture on the American prison state. Dan is a William Barnett Professor of Free Enterprise Studies and Assistant Professor of Economics at Loyola. He has a PhD from George Mason. His specialty in research is on prison systems and incarceration. And tonight, if you enjoy what you see here, make sure to join us on Facebook, find out things. And in spring, we're going to have 3 other kind of lectures similar to this on a wide range of topics. So make sure to look out for information on that. And please welcome Dan.
I really appreciate everybody coming out. Apparently Wiz Khalifa's playing next door. If I were y'all, I would have gone to that. But Colin put this together, so he really definitely deserves the credit on that margin. What I want to start today's presentation with is a summary of what modern macroeconomists refer to as the stylized facts of macroeconomics. Macroeconomics, in comparison to microeconomics, is focused on understanding the mechanisms of wealth creation. Adam Smith writes in 1776, an inquiry to the nature and causes of the wealth of nations. We more proverbially remember the title of that book as The Wealth of Nations, but the longer subscript is actually very revealing of what economics is really all about. Why are some countries rich and other countries poor? So if we think about what's inspiring Smith to write about the topic of the wealth of nations in 1776, it seems obvious in historical hindsight that the Industrial Revolution is underway in the developed world. He's writing from a position working for the Dutch East India Company. He has this unique foresight and observational opportunity to track and understand the mechanisms of capital production, accumulation, the effects of regulation. People who are less familiar with economic history read Smith and he sounds like a weird autistic guy who's just obsessed with corn, because hundreds and hundreds of pages in his magnum opus are dedicated to just measuring and accounting for the stocks of corn as they exist in England at his time. So if economic science more generally is focused on this question of why are some countries rich and other countries poor, what you need is some mechanism or mechanistic understanding of, well, where does wealth come from originally? How does it distribute itself around the world? And then in any particular time and place, why would wealth systematically increase or decrease structurally, according to like a cycle? So those are basically the 3 stylized facts of macroeconomics. You want a theory to explain the reality, but we should, before we begin, all be on the same page as to what the empirical facts of wealth are in the history of the modern world, for example. And so this sort of great undeniable truth that proponents of market economies really like to emphasize is just the general hockey stick of wealth. We are, pardon my French, rich bitch. Like, we live in a much wealthier world today than we did in recent historical past, predominantly because of massive technological innovations and accumulation of wealth post-industrialization. The second major stylized fact would be the distribution of wealth. So yes, all nations have experienced some degree of wealth accumulation, but not all of them have experienced it equally per se. So Western nations, for example, have received 12, 13-fold increases in standard of living since 1850, whereas third world nations have only received doubling or sometimes tripling of standard of living or real capital accumulation and consumption opportunity. The last stylized fact that macroeconomists concern themselves with is business cycles, fluctuations in growth and decline, like what we're mired in right now in terms of a financial recession. Now, why begin a lecture about the American prison state with a summary of the stylized facts of macroeconomic growth? Well, in simple terms, what I consider my entire research project to be is to approach this a different question with the same analytical toolkit of economics. So rather than focus upon wealth creation, right? For Smith, it's obvious. Smith didn't even really call himself an economist per se. He was a political philosopher who focused on political economy. It wasn't until, say, 20th century macroeconomics that economists became so obsessed with understanding pecuniary wealth and financial institutions in particular. The same structure of understanding incentives, of understanding the production and distribution of knowledge, the same structural search for a mechanism to explain particular forms of social phenomenon, I want to approach in order to understand the empirical reality of incarceration. Now, in other words, there is some general accumulation of incarceration over the course of history. There is some distribution of incarceration in different countries around the world today, and there's some cyclical patterns to incarceration in any particular country and over time. Now, one question would be, well, why would we want to look at this particular data set of incarceration per se? Well, I think punishment more generally is a really interesting concept. And this is sort of a shared appreciation I have with what's called postmodernism or subaltern studies. In other words, many people in the field of history have noticed that, well, it tends to be that when you're writing history about something like a war, winners get to write the bulk of the history books. And so, looking back, our available sample of evidence is typically biased in favor of winners of wars, and therefore inaccurate insofar as it glosses over the losers, or those people who get subjugated or oppressed by coercive force. In a post-industrial, post-colonial type world, we have to critically ask ourselves, well, what are the forms of subjugation that most people are subjected to? And arguably, the sort of newest technology on the scene, I would suggest being incarceration by means of state punishment. Secondly, I think it's important to fit the notion of state-sponsored punishment and state-sponsored violence in a broader theory of violence. So if we're asking questions of, well, how is violence produced and distributed around the world and over time, understanding how it is that formal state enforcement institutions contribute or detract from that level of violence is probably important in order to comprehend those trends. So in much similar fashion as we have stylized facts of macroeconomic growth, just to begin a discussion of understanding the mechanisms of wealth in pure macroeconomic discussions, there are good data today regarding the stylized facts of incarceral growth. Now, the last point about the field of modern macroeconomics that I would make is that thinking through the available evidence of the stylized facts, we know well about what the stylized facts of modern macroeconomics are today. Right? Smith didn't really have good bureaus of GDP calculators. Right? Smith didn't have a sophisticated Bureau of Labor Statistics calling him up and telling him the unemployment rate during a particular cycle that he might have been able to observe in the Enlightenment period developed world. He had a very biased sample, which is similar in concern to sort of this subaltern project. In that sense, the stylized facts of macroeconomics give us a way to understand the history of macroeconomic theory. The history of macroeconomic theory has been consistently biased as a function of the fact that we have only had small parts of the empirical reality of economic wealth accumulation over time. It's like there's an adage where two blind men are feeling different parts of an elephant, one the head and the other the tail, and they describe very, very different things, but yet they're sort of feeling just small portions of the same whole. We have a similar issue guiding the theories and concepts and models that we use to understand how wealth grows and accumulates when you only have a bit of the picture. So over the history of macroeconomic thought, our understanding has arguably improved. We began with very logistic, mechanical models of of wealth being determined by things like natural resources, like human capital resources. And today we have much more sort of complicated and nuanced understandings of how social institutions and rules of the game promote the growth of wealth within particular nations. Arguably, what I really want to talk about in this story, or in this lecture, is about how the methodologies and theories that are in criminological science have a similar problematic feature as modern macroeconomics, mainly that over the course of their history, they frame policy from a relatively ignorant perspective of the real stylized facts of incarceral power. And so today's awareness of the empirical reality of incarceral power is much better than it was in the past. But we can see a lot of the contributing problems that have occurred in the past to be the result of methodological challenges, to be the result of bad theories, essentially. So, what are the stylized facts of mass incarceration? Well, mass incarceration is a term that explicitly refers to the uniquely modern phenomenon of the dominant use of prison sentences as the main form of criminal punishment. Okay, so throughout human history, we have lots of different ways to punish people, right? Some cultures implemented death penalties, some cultures implemented very sort of visceral and public spectacle forms of punishment, like scaffolding and hangings and torture routines in public display. Others used like bodily harm features, like cutting off your hands or hobbling or binding parts of your body. The jail facility, the notion of isolating you from society, removing your liberties and removing you as a danger to other people as a criminal from society, and isolating you at the individual level, engaging your criminal sentence in terms of time on your person to be served in a penitentiary facility, that's a relatively modern phenomenon. It comes about pretty much around the same time as Adam Smith is writing The Wealth of an Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations. Now, incarceration is distinct from mass incarceration, which is uniquely American, uniquely post-1975, and very specifically and explicitly racially structured. And so those are the major components of that term as it's used in the literature. Empirically, this is what the trend sort of looks like. So we have a very similar hockey stick story, it isolated within the United States, as the sort of GDP hockey stick graph looks. So I almost feel like my first response to someone saying, well, you're an economist, why would you care about incarceration rates? In a similar way as you can't call yourself a political philosopher at the time of Smith and not have an explanation for the accumulation of wealth, because that's the new thing on the scene, right? Smith is walking around. Up until the Industrial Revolution, there was no stuff. There was no accumulation and abundance of corn. He was obsessed with corn because it was brand new and it was like a lifeblood of civilization and society. Arguably, we live in a world where the concept of massive amounts of people being incarcerated is brand new. One of my best friends, Randy, recently took a road trip to California in order to pursue a career opportunity, which failed miserably. He wanted to be a movie star. And then he turned around and drove back to Louisiana. And I said, Randy, interestingly enough, you just drove through basically Louisiana, Texas, and California. In passing on the highway, you were basically amidst a landmine of human beings in cages, greater than anyone else has ever had the opportunity to do in the course of human history. Right? He physically drove past boxes of human beings that were being incarcerated to a greater proportion than has ever existed. And he was, until he got back, totally unaware of this. Most people arguably are. So earlier we have, this is just sort of net prison population, pure number of individuals. Here we have imprisonment rate controlled for population, right? So an initial response to say observing the large increase in net population is to recognize and admit that we have increased net general population, free population. Like the increase in wealth around the globe has afforded us to have a larger population on net. So here we obviously have controlled per 100,000 population, which is also comparably significantly increasing in the post mid-1970 period. So again, you'll notice my commentary on each of these empirical slides is from the perspective of arguing that these are inefficient processes. My second sort of motivation in my research project is centered around a debate or a lack of consensus that I observed between, say, humanities disciplines, social science, social theory, sociology, criminology, political science. Most treat the concept of mass incarceration as a tremendous problem, inherently problematic. Terms in the literature include things like we are amidst a prison crisis, that these trends are unsustainable, unjust, etc. Economists, we're more positive thinkers insofar as we're not comfortable deeming things as just or unjust. We just merely want to like assess things in their positive sense. But arguably, I would suggest that incarceration seems to be a bad means at accomplishing a very particular end. That the purposes and intentions of incarceration over its history have proven difficult to accomplish, yet very, very expensive at both the pecuniary and social cost level. And so there are economists, though, who would argue that no, the pervasiveness and the stability of this institution demonstrate that it's a stable equilibrium, that it's an efficient response. So if we had, for example, a comparable increased population with a comparable increased net population of incarceration, then it would be an argument for, say, incarceration being both rational, reasoned, and proportioned. But here we have at least controlled for population, and it seems to be not a stable trend, but an exponential, or a growing trend. Here we have direct expenditures, and what I think is not only shocking is the general increase in correction spending being larger than the increased spending in other arenas of the criminal justice system. But notice that over the course of time from 1982 to 2006, you have a different structured pattern in which aspects take up the bulk of the net funding in criminal justice. So starting in 1982, you have a much more, it's almost a 50-50 share, even though it's on net significantly less. You have a 50-50 share between corrections and police, which to some extent, if you read books like Peter Moskos, I could ramble on about how cool Peter Moskos is. He got a sociology PhD from Harvard, then he became a cop in Baltimore, Maryland, and was one of the advisors for the show The Wire. His book, Cop in the Hood, argues that there's a radical change in police type over this course of history, where police change from being sort of on the street, members of the community, what's called community policing, and deterring crime from happening beforehand, right? Like it's difficult to mug a little old lady or break into a store when there's a uniformed officer with a silly hat walking up and down the street on a regular basis. Because of various bureaucratic incentives for spending money at the federal level, over the course of this history, you have this massive increase in expenditures, first of all, but you also have a very structured change in how that money gets allocated across different aspects. So, whereas Moskos points attention to the fact that we now respond to crime, we sort of let it take place and have a responsive system. This was driven in large part by the adoption of the transistor radio in policing, but also you can see in the distribution spending between corrections compared to police, right? Ideally, you would want to protect your person and property before harm takes place, but in the structured system that we have, resources, because of political incentives, tend to finance more punishment deterrence as opposed to preventative deterrence. Here you get a sense as to how many particular facilities we're talking about. So this is the graphic that I showed to my friend Randy as he drove through the Southwest. Since 2000, you see a lot more proliferation in the Southwest areas. This also doesn't necessarily control for the size of facilities. So these are new constructed facilities for housing people in jail, but California and Texas, for example, they tend to have much larger prison facilities than, which explains why it is that you would have more facilities in the other states. Mostly, I mean, land is cheap there. And here we get a similar sense of our GDP map that we started with, right? Whenever I show GDP breakdown around the globe, I sort of like to call it the where you want to live index, right? It's sort of obvious that wealthy countries are places that have certain forms of institutions where you feel safe in person and property, where there's a stable rule of law, where there are relatively fair elections. This is the conclusion of modern macroeconomics. And arguably, it's no different than Smith's observations in 1776. Adam Smith writes, clearly and obviously, little else is requisite to carry a nation from the lowest barbarism to the highest degree of opulence, but peace, easy taxes, and a tolerable administration of justice. Essentially, he's talking about what it is that modern macroeconomists call institutions, the rules of the game and their enforcement. It's obvious that similarly institutionalized countries with similar political structures, similar monetary regimes, similar access to market economies, have similar rates of growth. Countries with oppositionally similar institutions like corrupted political systems, erratic monetary changes, etc., they have similarly impoverished economies. Here we see that you get some degree of institutional similarity also maps onto incarceration trends. And this is sort of in other words, the state of what I would loosely call crime and punishment studies is at a similar methodological juncture as is modern macroeconomics, which is to say that the status quo explanation for punitive variance around the globe is an institutional explanation. This begins with a book in the early part of the 20th century by Rushin and Kurtheimer, I think. They're probably butchering the pronunciation of that. But it's one of the inspirations behind Michel Foucault's work on discipline and punishment. And basically their argument is that corporativist countries, Scandinavian corporativist countries, like Germany, for example, tend to have the beneficial aspects of economic development and democracy, but they maintain lower prison rates than do market liberal societies. Now, the causation that they provide is weird. They argue that the Scandinavian countries have larger labor unions. The larger labor unions constrain the access to global market economies. Constraining access to global market economies means that you avoid the business cycle. The business cycle at the trough is when crime takes place. Mitigating lower crime rates on net by avoiding business cycles means lower prison rates. So it's like a Rube Goldberg machine of like capitalism is to blame for large incarceration. But arguably, Foucault's whole research project sort of supports this narrative, which is to say that he's observing, again, almost like a sample bias of noticing that the rise of incarceration is in lockstep with the rise of global market capitalism. That it's in this post-industrial era that we have this new technological form and its subsequent growth. Arguably, I would say new institutional economists have done themselves no favors because they're this graph actually refers to, well, we'll get back to those. I'm going to skip ahead for just a second. Sorry. Didn't organize my slides right. Okay. New institutional economists have done themselves no favors. This is economic freedom correlated with prison population, which is it's a mild positive correlation. It doesn't hold universally across all the indexes. Like this is just one 2007 index from Cato against 2009 prison populations. We have broader data sets, and you don't get as strong of a positive correlation. But again, anecdotally, all of the contemporary new institutional punishment theorists observe that, hey, you know, it's the places with all the old white guys that seem to have the large prison populations. Like the places that speak English, the places that have market liberal economies. It's It's Canada, the United States, Britain, New Zealand, Australia. Right? We're the ones that seem to be driving the upward, or the higher end of mass incarceration around the globe. And again, I would say new institutional economists haven't done ourselves any favors in insulating this as a criticism or a condemnation against market capitalism. In large part because a lot of the arguments in what's called self-enforcing exchange discussions rely upon the notion that if you want to have a heterogeneous, large-scale, highly populated economy, you need an exogenous, anonymous enforcement apparatus to govern over contract adjudication. So the bigger your market gets, arguably, the more diversified any particular agents within that market might be for exchanging. And so the more credible of a commitment you would need to bind that enforcement in the legal system. I'm skeptical of that thesis, in large part because of ideas that students at FSU should really know very well, which is predominantly public choice concerns, that perhaps the sole authority over governing things like the power to incarcerate human beings in the hands of central bureaucratic governments might lend itself to corrupted incentives for constraining that power. So let's finish giving detail to the notion of what are the stylized facts of mass incarceration. This gives another sense of punitive severity around the globe apart from incarceration. This is frequency and legitimacy of the death penalty in different countries. So you have, blue countries have no death penalty. Red is that it's used against both adults and adolescents. Orange is death penalty used against adult offenders. Brown is only in times of war. And purple is death penalty not as accepted in the last 10 years. Again, perspective of the uniqueness of America's role in mass incarceration trend around the globe. So on the left you have the per capita ratios of a few dozen of major nations around the globe. And America sort of tops the scale according to this data is from 2008. The latest data I think that we have available is 2010, so it's not terribly updated from these trends. But then on the right here we have total number of inmates decimates the same 36 sample countries combined. Okay. So in some sense we've got significant reason or at least empirical starting points for the, say, humanities disciplines that have these justice concerns, right? We have a very structured, unequal system regarding race. So here we have the difference between, say, white males incarcerated compared to black male adolescents and Hispanics. In general, the proportions reverse themselves, right? So African Americans make up approximately 10% of the free population, yet the majority of the incarcerated population. I've been actively accused of trying to incite generational warfare, which normally I just sort of nod my head in response to that. But yes, I mean, if you reread Marx's Communist Manifesto, which I did recently, I found myself underlining things that I thought were false just on empirical margins. But after I underlined, I don't know, like 80% of the book, I decided that if you reverse the terms bourgeois and proletariat to old and young, a significant majority of all the things that I underlined as being false switch to being true. So here we see the age structured breakdown of incarceration rates. And here, again, this is very similar to how the spending has changed in recent history, because here you see how many of inmates are incarcerated for various different forms. So again, the public choice concerns should sort of like jump out at you. The way in which I think ordinary individuals would invest money in person, in security measures technologically and institutionally to secure person and property are not necessarily the way in which our political system allocates those resources. The way in which our political system allocates those resources are in order to enforce things which have particular advantages for those political institutions, longevity of power, as well as ability to create jobs and confer votes. In other words, would you be more willing to spend money to have a police officer patrol your neighborhood to make sure that people don't break into your house, or to make sure that people don't set arson, or people don't mug people in your neighborhood? Or would you outfit SWAT teams to break into people's houses to keep them from smoking joints in the comfort of their own living room? Like, I think that the basic incentives of people to invest in securing their person and property are obvious, whereas when we outsource these roles to governmental bureaucracies, we see a distribution of resources that's very out of step with those trends. So I see in a subfield of public choice, as well as forms of new institutional economics, a concern or an ability to diagnose the trend of mass incarceration as inefficient, or at least as problematic. Bob Higgs, for example, an economic historian of significant talent, noticed that as of the trends in 2007, if prison populations were to continue to increase as they were, by the year 2080, the American prison population would outpace the free population, which is basically within the lives of most of the people who are currently American citizens. And the one sort of silver lining to that is maybe that'll force us to have a more reasonable immigration policy, because we'll need new people to staff the prisons. But so here we have an interesting quote from George Stigler, right? Stigler thinks that whatever is efficient, right? This is sort of the same graph as the economic freedom, or perceiving that the growth in population is what's driving the growth in prison population. That if this social institution has endured some test of time, is persistent around multiple countries, then it must prove efficient. Well, that's true to some extent. It proves efficient for certain intentions. And again, public choice helps us recognize that those intentions and those ends are predominantly political, as opposed to functional. So I think that we should contextualize these trends as trends more than stable equilibrium, first off. Again, my sort of challenge to Stigler is very much motivated by David Friedman's article on private institutions and efficient private institutions and enforcement of law. He did a historical investigation of medieval Iceland, which was basically an anarchist system, and found that they had an elaborate and functional formal legal code that protected people from violent crimes, and an adjudicated pricing mechanism to administer punishment for those crimes. In the Anglo-Saxon legal tradition, these things are called vergels, blood prices, where if you violate certain types of crimes, it's literally translated into forms of repayment for those bodily harms. Now, Friedman's insight came from a debate that took place between him and other neoclassical economists at the time, who were basically arguing that the provision of private law enforcement suffered from the challenges of public goods dilemmas. That you couldn't hope to have an efficient system based on the voluntary investment of ordinary people, because there are spillover benefits. If you hire a cop to secure your house at night, I can slough off that responsibility myself, because if I live right next door to you, what are the chances of someone breaking into my house getting away with it while there's an officer patrolling your neighborhood? So this is similar to lighthouse issues, similar to other public goods problems. There's a concern that there'll be an under-provision. Well, Friedman says, yeah, that makes sense, I suppose, when your model of law enforcement is very static and narrowly defined to contemporary police, courts, and prisons. What he admits to, though, that the historical experience of Iceland shows him is that if you change those institutional backdrops, you can get a lot of different equilibrium regarding the private investment in law enforcement. So in Iceland, which they didn't have a legal system based around time-based criminal sentencing, but instead around a vergel system, you did manage to get an efficient investment in private security, given that alternative institutional constraint. So I mean, to some extent, I see a lot of reason to take Friedman's claim seriously, to challenge the efficiency of incarceration as a functional response to crime. So another criticism would be, okay, if crime was going up and down in conjunction with prison rates, then we would say, good institution, it works, it does what it's told. So here we have violent crime rate. And yes, it does seem to grow in conjunction with the hockey stick graph of incarceration rates. And then you could even look and say, oh, and turns out, once we get to that top peak of incarceration, our violent crime rate declines. Neat, sounds like a great story. But given our extreme expenditures, it doesn't make sense that crime decline, that both the crime peak and decline has been shared in a variety of institutional environments that haven't spent as much money and physical resources as we have on mass incarceration. So here you have, we notice that the violent crime trend peaking around the early to mid-1990s is shared in Great Britain as well as in Canada. You see the same form of leveling off. But when you compare the expenditure rates between these countries, America has the significantly higher expenditure rate. Similarly with our incarceration rate. So here we also have violent crime trends in a much more longer view of American history. We have homicide rates dating back all the way to 1650, and we see that we've gotten these massive declines in homicide, but they were not correlated with massive increases in incarceration at the time. In other words, we've been able to buy ourselves these crime declines in previous periods, but without the extreme expense of mass incarceration that we share today. Lastly is the point that most people don't really know the empirical realities of crime or punishment in the United States. A term that I really enjoy and understand well, I borrow from Brian Kaplan. Voters in America are rationally irrational when it comes to their beliefs and opinions about the criminal justice system. Brian Kaplan argues that in public choice economics, we have this concept called rational ignorance. That the reason why you all don't spend every waking moment during election season in the library learning political economy, learning political science, learning public choice economics, etc., in order to make informed and accurate decisions to vote for the best candidate who's going to bring our country into the dawning of a new era, is predominantly because, well, when you watch MTV's Jersey Shore and Snooki's on, and she explains that she voted for John McCain because he was so cute in all his speeches, you realize that your vote is worth no more or less than Snooks. Now, in that vein, you stop reading so much. You stop paying as much attention. You make political decisions based on common factors as Snooki does. And so this is true as well. I mean, it's all the more true, so to speak, on issues that don't bear as much relevance in public politics. So major issues in today's political climate, things like international relations, military involvement, and the economy, right? We didn't talk much in the debates about domestic law and order, right? These were much more significant issues in the 1970s and late 1960s when crime was relatively high. But in the aftermath of even, say, the 1990s crime decline, we have some significant public opinion data on what people think about crime. People are wrong about how much crime is in their area. People are also wrong about how crime is responded to in their area. But we're not just wrong. We're not Snooki. Snooki's just an idiot. She would just pull numbers out of her butt. She would say, I don't know, lots of people go to jail. Not a lot of people go to jail. It would be random. You're worse than Snooki, in a sense. Most voters are worse than Snooki insofar as they're not just stupid when it comes to the empirical realities of crime and punishment. They're systematically biased in a very particular way. We systematically overestimate how much crime is in our local areas. We systematically underestimate how long prison sentences are for certain crimes. We systematically underestimate the costs of the criminal justice system in terms of financial amounts. We also tend to have what these show is sort of like bland approval ratings for the various components of the criminal justice system. When you ask people like, do you like cops, scale of 1 to 10, you get somewhere between a 4 and a 6 over periods of time where things like police brutality or crime rates oscillate much more significantly than the public opinion does, right? In similar ways, so you get real crime variance, but public opinion is just sort of like static. In other words, we form our opinions about how well our criminal justice system works by margins not necessarily related to the realities of crime and punishment. Arguably, there is a significant increase in approval ratings of ethics of police officers over time, correlated with incidents of police militarization and police brutality, which is strange. But proportion to the number of increased police officers that happen to be alive. And if you look at the anthropology literature on police social networks, you see that there's like strong family ties in the policing industry. So in other words, what I'm saying here is that moving from, say, 37 to 63% approval ratings tracks weirdly onto the proportioned increase in just police officers and the number of people who have police officers in their family and extended social networks. So say like in 1975, not that many people necessarily knew a cop or thought much of them, whereas now lots more people, oh, I know cops, like and they're my friends. However, when you control for race or urban location, people who have more experience with the criminal justice system have lesser opinions. So if you're rich, white, and vote Republican, and have never really like been bothered by a cop, you think that they're great. Poor or black Democratic voters in urban environments, they have much lesser opinions of police officers as well as court systems in their area. And again, most people presume that too little is spent. Right? Now, this should all be contextualized in terms of real economic revealed decision making, right? If you take surveys of people and you say, hey, who wants to spend more on healthcare? Who wants to spend more on roads and infrastructure? Who wants to spend more on education? Who wants to spend more on security and police? Most people, right, to the tune of 70% across these issues oftentimes, raise their hand. They say, yes, of course, these are good things. I want more of them. When you change the question to who wants to spend more on these things if it means a higher tax rate, the approval ratings decline from like 70 to significant minority, 20 to 30%. If you actually had people choosing between these issue spaces in sort of a more economical sense, you would see totally different results still. I mean, it's sort of the notion like, who wants a Ferrari? Everybody raises their hand. But obviously you don't. Obviously you could be making sacrifices to afford one. You could be driving a Ferrari but wearing clothes from Walmart and eating beans every day and all of these other things. You choose not to do that. You choose, I don't know, a Ford Focus. In a demonstrated preference sense, you prefer Ford Focuses over Ferraris, but at the current market prices. Now, it's my claim that the course of criminological history has suffered an inability to theorize about the causes of crime and the effective responses of punishment, in large part because of a similar ignorance regarding the facts and realities of crime and punishment. And so the remaining of the lecture is predominantly focused on the structural differences between schools of thought of criminology. So here we have a quote from Cesare Beccaria, who points out the very difficult subjectivist problem of crime and punishment. Different people will perceive different costs and benefits to the behaviors of crime and punishment. This was the major challenge in the context of the Enlightenment that made everybody very uneasy about administering law enforcement. Jeremy Bentham, another classical economist and crime theorist at the time, pointed out, arguably hundreds of years prior to the UCLA price theory tradition, which contained economist Armin Alchian. Armin Alchian devised the third law of demand, what's called Alchian-Allen effects. Third law of demand states that when you have a constant transaction costs over two things, you're going to opt towards higher quality. I have an appropriate example and an inappropriate example. We'll go with the appropriate one. Married people with children tend to go to the opera more frequently than they go to the movies compared to couples without children. Because the married people with children have to pay a cost of a babysitter no matter where they go. Right? So if you're paying for a babysitter every time you go to the movies, you're giving up fewer nights at the movies in order to go to the opera. So for them, going to the opera is in opportunity costs cheaper than people who don't have children. Beccaria noticed that if you apply this insight to crime, you can really screw up the social world that we live in. Because if you get the punishment mechanism wrong, you're in a sense encouraging people to perform more severe crimes. If I get punished no differently if I kick you in the shin or cut off your head, but I gain value from committing violence against you, then I'm going to cut your head off. If I have no different punishment if I steal $5 from you or $1 million from you, then in the process of stealing from you, I'm opted to steal as much as I possibly can because the punishment is no different. In response to that, Bentham designs explicitly the penitentiary model. The entire panopticon is designed explicitly to overcome this issue. That since we're going to have different people weighing the costs and benefits of crime at different rates, and since we don't want to encourage more severe crimes on the margins, we need a giant machine that can calculate and attend punishments just to you. Once we figure out that right amount, well, we're going to harness and impose this penalty just on you to get you to be deterred in just the right amount. And so we'll separate you in a particular cell, and we'll constantly observe your behavior, and then calculate the time that you're subjected to that cell in just the right amount. Incarceration was originally a rehabilitative proposal. It just didn't work. They took the idea from monks, penitentiary, to induce penitence. It was believed that if you were just left to your own devices for long enough, you would think about what you did and realize that it was wrong, and you would become a union with God, and so on and so forth. Turns out that when you take happy-go-lucky monks who think that they've sinned and put them in a room by themselves and they come out reformed, you get a very different result when you take a criminal who's very pissed off that they got caught doing what they didn't want to be caught doing and put them in a room. So over the course of criminological history, the theoretical models radically changed, in large part because of the opportunities created in real logistic quantitative measurement. So this asshole, and I'm really comfortable calling him Lombroso, was arguably the father of the eugenics movement. So again, we've got this challenge of like biased sample. He saw in the realities of incarceration a great opportunity to study people. And what he realized was that criminals are ugly compared to ordinary people. He looked in jail cells, he saw people with scars on their face, with deformed arms and limbs, sort of like bulges and bruises all over their bodies. Didn't stop to think about like how police were beating them or punishing them before they got there, but recognized that, well, there must be given that they also have all of these sort of like physical abnormalities, let's measure their heads, let's measure their foreheads, their noses, and the proportion of their eye shape and all of these things, and notice that, well, yeah, criminals seem to be biophysically different than ordinary people. So he proposes that the families that birth criminals should be, well, controlled in population or isolated from other people. One of his students took a more sociological perspective, that rather than just measuring foreheads and eye and nose proportions, he measured the sociological features of criminal agents. I mean, think about it. For the first time ever, you've got a sample of people that you can ask questions that they have to answer, you can calculate data on them and record over time. The positivist tradition of social science is birth in in the early part of the mid part of the 19th and 20th century by the criminological positivists. And so Lacasagni noticed that so many criminals in the facilities that he studied were orphans and shared this sort of similar sociological trait of being neglected by their families. Structural functionalism took place in the early part of the 20th century in the United States. These guys were similarly foaming at the mouth to study the prison community, as were the positivists. They weren't obsessed with empirical measures as much as they were social structures and functioning processes. They were sort of like the Austrian economists of their day. Gresham Sykes, arguably in this paragraph, defines a theory of prison riots that's very comparable to the classical liberal distinction between law and legislation. He says that criminal networks within prison facilities have an informal government of their own, and that the wardens come in and they impose a form of legislation upon that. If those two systems are out of whack with one another, everything goes to hell in a handbag and the inmates riot. If those two things are more harmonious with one another, you can maintain a relatively stable society within the prison system. Structural functionalists complain explicitly that it's the darn positivist statisticians that ruin their research project, when everybody gets obsessed with math and everybody gets obsessed with counting things. By the time the late 1960s and 70s hit, we're pretty much sold on the fact that the giant machines that were designed to calculate and formalize criminal punishments, they don't really work that good at rehabilitation. One author, Martinson and Lipton, did an expansive survey of all of the empirical literature that had been done on rehabilitation up until then. And it ended up running in the New York Times in this ominous title, "Nothing Works." And it was because they were observing both increases in crime in the early part of the 20th century, from say the 1930s to the 1960s, that crime was getting more frequent and more violent. And last, recidivism rates were the bulk of that crime increase. In other words, you commit a minor crime, we put you to jail, this machine that's supposed to make you a better person so that we can release you back into society, yet when you actually do get released, you commit more crimes of more severe type than when you originally came in. And so this study really had a damning effect on the practical implications of the rehabilitation project. Martinson was so distraught by the interpretations of his findings, he threw himself out of his own bedroom window, committing suicide. Totally unrelated to Gary Becker's model, an economic version of Becker sort of lays the groundwork for a more responsibility-driven interpretation of criminality based on rational choice. And so if crime is a rational decision on the part of criminals, then there is a sense of legitimacy for a retributive model of criminal punishment. Now that's how it's politically interpreted. The retributive philosophical justification is not necessarily in Becker. And again, this brings back the debate between Friedman and others at the time, where Friedman notices that, hey, you know, Becker's model, if you just put it in place in a particular institutional environment, means ratchet up the penalty, because you're raising the costs. It doesn't tell us, though, how people perceive the costs and benefits. It doesn't completely resolve what Beccaria noticed in the late 1700s, that for different people, penalties might be perceived in different ways. That in some social environments, as we have with like the drug war, for example, prison sentences can be perceived as like a badge of honor, or a signaling device amongst the community that you're trustworthy and not part of the man. Fast forward a little bit to more modern times, and the neoclassical economics project has become extremely narrowly focused and extremely formalistic. Stephen Levitt's discussion is about why crime fell in the 1990s in major urban environments. Right? And he measures explicitly different factors that cause it, and it's sort of multi-causal. There is no broader quest for a universal theory of crime and punishment taking place as much anymore, but for wonderful people like our own who spent it here at Florida State University. I think to some extent, I'm much more on board with Friedman than the bulk of neoclassical or Chicago economists who talk about crime punishment. I'm far more interested to ask if the institutional type itself is working. Because I think that its high and rising costs and the empirics that we began with expose a potential for instability and unsustainability, that we should take more seriously the radical proposals of people like Angela Davis, not an economist at all, not a friend of free market capitalism in any stretch, but willing to think more creatively about the presumptions of our social institutions. Her argument here is just like, what if in the future we end up looking back at the forms of incarceration as we do today regarding slavery? Her argument is that we take it as a means of presumption that incarceration is the effective way of responding to crime, not something that has been proved and demonstrated, which I think, again, the empirical, historical reality of incarceration tends to say. We're out of time, but I'm happy to field question and answers.
Halfway through your lecture, you talked about how crime rates dropped in the 90s, and also funding increased, but perception of crime also went up. So why do you think that perception of crime increased while crime was decreasing and spending on policing personnel was increasing?
The explanation that's in the literature that I find unsatisfactory is the role of media, as well. There's Catherine Beckett has an article where she basically credits politicians with sort of duping and fabricating beliefs in society regarding law and order spending, which appeals to my like inner public choice economist, but I'm skeptical of, insofar as I'm skeptical of like lots of sort of like conspiratorial explanations. The second part of that theory is about the role of media, that the media plays this significant and tangible role in shaping the way people perceive. Now, I find that reasonable, but it doesn't seem to hold up to that much empirical investigation. Because if you compare, say, cross-country, like places that have high expenditures in media or high technologies in disseminating media, you're not going to see a significant effect in the sort of punitive preferences of the population. So I'm not sure that like we have a fantastic explanation as to why those approval or the perceptions of crime have increased in that time. Other than it could be that the prominence of crime in our political landscape has declined, so the potentials for rationality have become more affordable on the margin, if that makes sense.
To go with that, is there any kind of a correlation with like the tech bubble right there? Like, is there just a general, like I know that goes along with the labor thing earlier, but does a general increase in wealth actually have any significant correlation or
To
the
perceptions?
Well, not to perception, to the actual violent crime rate itself.
Access to technology. So are more technologically advanced countries
Well,
more
just the wealth in general from the tech bubble, as in people are getting richer, thus the violent crime going down, that's why violent crime is decreasing while...
Sure, I mean, I think that the violent crime decrease is predominantly a function of wealth increase, yes.
So you talked about how in the mid-90s the crime rate in the U.S. went down, and well, Levitt attributes that to the Roe v. Wade Supreme Court case.
He attributes some of it. There's a difference between being statistically significant and the bulk of the explanation.
Well, I mean, I've only read for economics. Maybe you can look more into
So Levitt has a multi-causal approach, right? One explanation is increased prison sentence, increased prison population. He basically attributes that to the bulk of the deterrent effect. The second issues involve increased wealth, increased self-enforcement. And then this is what I find frustrating about people's interpretation of that paper. People remember that paper because it's sexy, it sounds really weird. It's like, okay, so unwanted children are declining in this environment, so there's fewer potential criminals. And it's supported by like anthropological studies about the criminogenic effects of single-parent households.
I read it from his book. I mean,
Yeah.
I know he was trying to sell, like, he wrote it with somebody from the New York Times.
Right.
They were trying to sell a book, so
But it's-
maybe they made it more.
The puzzle, I would say, how to interpret that paper, is that, hey, he tried to throw everything he could empirically at this regression to get rid of this Roe v. Wade effect. He originally started it as an instrumental variable to control for other things. He figured, well, this isn't going to have an effect, so I can use this because it's clean compared to my other variable. In reality, he kept getting correlation out of it. So it's not so much that it's the fact that, oh, this is obviously the explanation of crime. It's one of many. And I think that is a testament to how difficult it must be to centrally plan a response to crime. In other words, there's another good book by this guy, Mark Kleiman, called When Brute Force Fails. And his is very comparable to Malcolm Gladwell's explanation of crime decline in Manhattan, that there were lots of these contextual factors, that if you clean up graffiti and turn the lights on in the subway terminal, it's a much less inviting environment to like mug little old ladies. So you can either spend tons of money on building prison facilities and administering court costs and arresting people, or you can like change the light bulb in your infrastructure and clean up graffiti on the wall. Like, one's obviously cheaper than the other, but it's also more of a dynamic and complicated process to recognize. So again, I think this supports a public choice or even like an Austrian vision of understanding crime and punishment, because you need that sort of like local knowledge, and you need an environment of decision-making that avoids the forms of moral hazard problems and bureaucratic incentive biases that the political system establishes.
And then you also mentioned that similar things happened in Britain and Canada. Why do you think, what were the causes?
I think the major decline in violent crime in urban areas is attested to not a resolution of the drug war, but to the empirical realities of declined drug use. Levitt also has papers on this. If you look at, say, the production and distribution of crack cocaine, and you look at survey evidence. So my students always find this hard to believe. If you ask high schoolers whether or not they've tried certain drugs on anonymous surveys, you get significant responses. Like, normally, I would think, like, I'm not answering anything. But sure enough, from the 1970s until today, we've administered these types of surveys, and you get a massive spike around the early periods of crack. You get a significant decline in the aftermath. In other words, people realize, whoa, some of these drugs are really, really bad for you. And sure enough, even though addiction is a serious thing, and certain substances are more viscerally addictive than others, you get less experimentation and less persistent usage of these substances in the same time period as the violent crime has declined. Like the sheer amount of crack cocaine that's going on and compared to alternative substances has radically changed. So the drug trade is adapting in ways that our bureaucratic administration and enforcement can't keep up with. Methamphetamine is like the checkers of drug distribution, right? They can come in, plug into the modular infrastructure, make meth really quickly. So you don't have street feuds in that compared to the way you did when you had a bottleneck international distribution channel of cocaine.
So you think it was like a generational sort of thing, like in the 90s, that's when they stopped doing so much crack?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say it's just like, oh, people who lived in the 90s liked crack compared to other people. That might be true. But I mean, my guess is you could get anybody to really like crack.
I guess my question is, what are these radical alternatives? I mean, it's not like you're advocating like frontal lobotomies for...
No, not at all. I mean, to some extent, it's the real problem is that the perception of denying the necessity of incarceration is perceived as radical, right? So one radical alternative that has been promoted recently is also by Peter Moskos, the guy who wrote the Cop in the Hood book. His latest book is called In Defense of Flogging, which is, I mean, it's a sexy way to sell a book, right? But in all of his interview responses, his opening statements have been, I'm dead serious. And the reason why he continuously says this is because what he's really trying to do is give a platform for exposing the sorts of historical problems that I pointed out, right? And it's a sexy way to sell a book. But his argument is actually really interesting in like Foucault terms, right? What he's arguing is that the visceral spectacle realities of punishment pre-Enlightenment, pre-industrialization, had a built-in constraint. When people went to the public spectacle and saw and confronted the realities of punishment, they thought more critically about creative institutional alternatives for solving social problems in like a Tocquevillian sense. They had to invest in civil society and community norms in ways that outsourcing punishment and secluding it to the sort of confined, secretive environment of our incarceration facilities allows the state a greater power potential, right? It gives them an opportunity for public choice incentives much more significantly than visceral forms of penalties. And so another interesting book on that is by a scholar at Reed College, Darius Rajali, where he notices that not only is the correlation between mass incarceration unique to, say, like Western market liberal democracies, but so are all of the inventions of non-scarring forms of torture. It was France and the United States, advanced, developed, progressive democracies, that invented waterboarding, electroshock therapy, and solitary confinement, and other forms of penalties that do not any longer leave scarring or evidence on the body. And so when you think in these terms, they're lowering the cost of administering penalties to themselves, which affords them an opportunity to do it much more significantly.
As far as state incarceration rates are concerned, what would explain why states would adopt similar types of criminal justice policies, given that they have a high degree of discretionary power, and also variation in institutions, in that they could have different policies and essentially change the rules of the game of incarceration?
So here's why I think the drug war alone is an insufficient answer, right? Like a lot of people look at my evidence and work and say, all right, get rid of the drug war and we'll solve this problem. I think that's the equivalent of saying if you get rid of Al-Qaeda, we won't have a military-industrial complex. In other words, the incentives, the money, the job creation formula of mass incarceration and domestic law and order is no different from the military-industrial complex, other than the fact that it's in our own backyard. Now, why don't states do something about this? Here's another reason why the drug war is an insufficient explanation to explain America's exceptionalism in mass incarceration. Everyone criminalizes drugs, but for Portugal, and recently. Not everyone does it the American way, which is that we federally finance it and incentivize local states to comply with that enforcement regime. Now you get some non-compliance with marijuana dispensaries and marginal legalizations going on in recent elections. But overall, and again, things were illegal long before the late 1970s. The war on drugs, the federally subsidized, financed, and incentivized local level law enforcement for drug enforcement is very unique to the United States. It's a very unique feature of our democratic process that isn't necessarily shared by these other countries that do have similar legislations on the books. And so the mechanisms that I would say are really dangerous in this question is things like the asset forfeiture clauses that are going on in some states, where basically if you have too much cash on you, cops can take it without pressing charges against you and keep it. That local police jurisdictions are given the financial wealth that they confiscate from drug lords, which means it's like a form of tax in the way in which the suppliers respond, but it's not like a form of tax in the way in which our society is affected. When you and I give tax, and this is actually a debate that takes place in the criminal justice literature, progressives want to say, well, this is a problem of the proportions of how we spend our money. All these stupid Republicans want to spend on law and order, but all us enlightened leftist New Dealers want to spend on schools and stuff. Well, the New Deal had the carceral program built into it, and the money inevitably got tapped from community services into law and order as community services failed on the margins and criminogenic effects occurred in urban environments. That's sort of a natural consequence of the partisan system. So if we just increased all our school spending tomorrow, it's not going to get rid of this infrastructure of police spending. And again, in terms of people's behavioral biases, when the school quality declines, you're willing to cut budgets and reallocate resources. When crime goes up, people's mental imaginations presume that this is the only way that we respond to this.
So I have a question about some of your graphs.
Uh-huh.
The Cato Institute 2007 one is about the economic freedom.
Right.
What's the standard that's being applied for economic freedom?
In the Cato report, in 2007, I think it was, they were using a report done by Heritage, which is, I think, it's a 3-variable report based on, like, it's traditionally like income tax and corporate tax rates and regulation. Whereas a more significant source on economic freedom, I would say, that's being more manipulated in academic circles is the Fraser Index. The Fraser Institute is centered out of Vancouver, Canada. They have data from the late 1970s up until 2010. And that ranks economic freedom according to like 12 different margins. 3 key areas, but then subcategories within them. So it's everything from like tax to GDP ratio, regulatory complexity, legal system functionality, security, property rights. Richard Wortney, who's on faculty here at FSU, is one of the key investigators of the Fraser report. You should like park outside his office. Introduce yourself.
Well, my other question was about the graph about homicide, showing 16 feet. What was the source of that?
Alex Tabarrok compiled that for a number of papers that he has on systematic violence. But it was taken from, I want to say there's like a longitudinal study on violence. Like Steven Pinker has a lot of new work on this as well.
I saw Better Interested in Nature in the same graph
Yeah.
going down. And the reason why I asked is because the Philadelphia Society had a similar study where they had a bunch of people who were trying to examine, a little different, but it's about homicide and wars,
Okay.
tribal relations
Sure.
in states. But it still had homicide as one of the principles of violence that was put into the study. Had it going the other way, which was pretty much inverted, which was going up on a scale.
Interesting.
Because it's trying to account for the problem being, scale. There's more people here now than there were then, so it's hard to account for. But it tried to account for scale, and said even with scale, it went the other way.
Okay. I'd be interested to see that because I'm very unsatisfied with Pinker's.
Right.
sort
Yeah.
of
Because
commentary.
that's why I had the same picture. I don't.
Typically, the Torture and Democracy book is what I think of in response to Pinker. Basically, yes, maybe we are declining our objective measure of violence between ordinary individuals, but we're changing the structure and shape of violence in our society, and arguably empowering large bureaucratic institutions to administer violence as opposed to ordinary individuals. And I think that flies in the face of a lot of the development findings that you see from like Asimov, Johnson and Robinson, and colonial origin studies, that we're actually very good at resolving violence between ordinary individuals, and actually very weak at defending ourselves against predatory bureaucracies.
So you said ending the drug war wouldn't be enough to lower the incarceration rates. What about the theory that it could level off the share of minorities incarcerated? Is that a plausibility? Like in terms
So you're saying if we eliminated the drug war, we would at least ameliorate the structural inequality of mass incarceration?
Yeah, and I guess that would lead
Well,
to
I think
better depiction of minorities.
I think you're absolutely right on that margin. So if our goal is fixing urban poverty as it exists in the states today, I think that like step one, I would say like get rid of the drug war immediately. Like you would make a lot of disaffected African Americans much better off in a very short period of time. And yes, I'm totally willing to say that.
Have you read the Jukes study, which was done in 1874, about the family of criminals and bootleggers, and they're basically a bunch of, it was a collection of like 4 or 23 families, actually, I think it was, done in 1870. Did you read that?
Not recently enough to comment.
Okay, because the reason why I ask is that the conclusion that he brings up, I mean, it was done in 1874, but the conclusion that he has is that they have poor environmental conditions, included not just where they were living, but how they were living, so their poverty level. And it seems to be something that's correlated with most common day sociologists, that there's some correlation, I don't know which way it goes, between poverty and crime rates. So it seems that there is something to do in these, more wealthy nations, that the large wealth disparities, I mean, that's also embedded into the problem?
Well, so here again, like in response to say like a Pinker observation, is a new book by this guy Stuntz called The Collapse of American Criminal Justice, and he talks about the structural effect of where crime is located. So despite a net decline in violent crime around the nation, when you look at where crime is taking place, we're sort of building these cesspools of significant violent crime. So in certain neighborhoods, in certain major metropolitan areas, crime has significantly gone up. And so in addition to that, I would say these environmental conditions are a significant concern. So again, it's like when you look at Charles Murray's latest book, Tearing Apart or Falling Apart, he's trying to control for race, and so looking at just at poor whites and wealthy whites, and noticing all these like massive sociological differences in the way in which these communities participate in civil society, marriage, like occupational roles, societal expectations, child rearing, like you get patternistic differences between the wealthy and the poor. But the wealthy are like this like elite bubbled class compared to the poor. Yet the wealthy have decision-making authority over the adjudicated rules that govern over the poor. And so again, that gets back to the drug war issue. It's one thing to say, oh well, there are these social correlates to crime that are also correlated with poverty. It's another thing to say, well, yeah, you're sort of like kicking them when they're already down. Like poverty is a very difficult thing to overcome. It's all the more difficult to overcome when you insulate the only profit in a black market environment through the drug war, when you hyper-regulate legitimate markets through minimum wage, and so on and so forth. So I mean, getting at the heart of causation in that story, I mean, we have anecdotal perspectives and theoretical perspectives. I don't know exactly how we can like formally test and win that argument. But my guess is we're in agreement on that.
What about as far as we talk about the difference between races? What about the sexes? Since the answer, almost the number of females almost probably less than the number of white males.
So I mean, it's interesting to contextualize the abortion finding, right? Because like single,
the economic, more women are often poorer than men.
yeah. Well,
Often use less or have to do with children as well.
There's a lot of empirical literature that argues that gender doesn't matter in the criminogenic effects on your children. So if you have a two-parent household, that's all that really matters. If you're a single-parent household or a divorced household or an unwanted child.
You know what I'm saying? For the parent is usually a female.
Right.
One right in the child is a female.
Right.
And that makes them even worse.
So having like lesbian parents doesn't necessarily make you any less economically well off.
I'm not talking about the children. I'm talking about the actual parent. Since women are usually the ones raising the children,
right?
That they are usually often also economically worse off because they have to pay for themselves and their children.
Parent is offender.
Sure.
Parents, yes.
Sure.
Not the children, not the parents, but the parents themselves.
But I mean, in general, my point is just that you're right to notice gender disparity at the community level. So most of our studies regarding the influence of gender on criminogenic effects of children are at the microanalysis, like a single household. And it seems insignificant, which is enlightening and progressive, right? It's like, yes, you like gays, straights, men, women, like we're all good at being parents. However, at the community level, gender balance does seem to matter, because when you take all of the adult men out of a population and you only have adolescent men, they tend to be dicks, and like get into trouble, and the adult women have a difficult time sort of imposing physical force to constrain them, and there's a lot of anthropological reports to support that. How are we doing on time, Colin?
We have room to 10, but you guys can leave if you need.
No
We'll
one's
take a few more, two more maybe?
Sure.
No one has one I can ask about. The increasing trend in privatization as far as kind of sourcing out prison funding for our prison control. Can we talk about that in
Sure.
regards to your research?
A lot of the humanities is like hyper concerned about privatization, and you're right, it's a growing trend. However, compared to net increases in incarceration more generally, privatization is pretty insignificant. It's like within the range of 5 to 8%. Some states have a lot more, Texas, California, Florida. Predominantly they're the states that are most cash-strapped, fiscally burdened with mass incarceration. So on the margins, they tend to contract those services out. Much like charter movement schools are a sort of Band-Aid for dealing with fiscal imbalance and state spending. Most of the literature on that seems to focus on the fact that, like, how dare anyone profit off of other people's misery? For greedy, heartless capitalists like myself, I don't see a difference between that and profiting in any other way. Like, an ice cream man profits off of my misery. Life without ice cream is misery. When I have ice cream, it's less miserable. So I've written on this in basically just parallel Bruce Benson's argument. Benson has a great chapter where he's saying, look, I'm not a fan of contracting out because I wouldn't want, like, Hitler to be more efficient at, like, shooting people. I have a problem with the state being more efficient in launching the drug war. So the predominant question should be, what are the laws that are being enforced by this enforcement apparatus? I think that's right. But I think what's good about the privatization discussion is pointing out this role of profiting off of misery exposes the incentive compatibility between law enforcement and actually avoiding crime. If we turn incarceration into a profit-making strategy, which happens whether or not it's a private company or the state, then we have a grouping of people and a network of incentives that is not to deter crime and promote social order, but is instead to grow the bureaucratic apparatus of law enforcement, which might be a function of how high crime is instead of how low it is. So people are talking about, oh, well, there are companies making money off of high crime rates, so now they have an incentive to keep crime rate high. That's true. It's a small number of companies compared to the extreme number of state officials. Like, the last bastion of unionism in the United States is public education and public prison public prison employees and police officers. So, I mean, those are vested interests in hiring additional people like themselves, funneling more budgets into their bureaucracies. Those same complaints that are commonly leveled against private prison contractors should also be leveled against the state in administering those services as well. Like, it is a make-work program. It's a shovel-ready job type of production program.
I guess just to cap everything off, if you take impression with the prisons.
No. Thumbs down.
We talked about some of the other alternatives. Jimmy kind of got at it, but directly, what do you think would be better?
I really like studying restitution systems. I think they're fascinating. I think that a tremendous amount of effective enforcement and deterrence can be accomplished through tort processes in the civil law. I think that drug use in particular is a medical issue. I think that the nature of addiction is very poorly understood in terms of traditional crime, theories of crime. And I think that parole systems can be very good in much the same way as we have, like, host programs for immigration, right? If you want a more liberal immigration program, but you're still concerned about just, like, letting people through, then having host sort of like sponsors where this person's responsible for making sure that you have a job, a place to live, and, like, are complying with certain regulatory frameworks. I think that as a means of responding to releases and or more milder forms of criminality is a good strategy. There's a restorative justice movement that's underway that's really interesting. It's sort of like restitution programs, but what they're finding is that, like, I mean, the people who got really into restorative justice are, like, crazy Jesus folk. And so they have a lot of, like, coming to Jesus moments between victim and perpetrator. And it's not like, oh, they gave cash. It was more like they, like, hugged it out. And it's remarkable to, like, read those reports, because in the context of inequality-driven crime, you'd be surprised how many sort of like well-to-do victims are empathetic with their not so well-to-do perpetrators, and how many not so well-to-do perpetrators are deeply apologetic about having to resort to petty crime and thievery. And just the communication process sort of breeds a sense of social harmony in those circumstances. I mean, it's not economics when you read these studies, but it's interesting, and it seems like it's having significant success. Thanks for coming out, everybody.
Thanks, Dan.